America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Jordan Bruneau. Joining us today is Jonathan Williams, President and Chief Economist of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. Jonathan's here to talk to us today about the latest in education freedom. Job Creators Network has been lucky to work with ALEC on our Education Freedom Alliance, and it's great to have Jonathan come in and give us a check-in and update on our progress. Jonathan, thanks a lot for joining us.
Well, Jordan, thanks so much for having me, and really great to work with you guys and the members of the Education Freedom Alliance and see so much good happening across the country right now for families.
Yeah, it's really been an amazing momentum to watch. I mean, as somebody who has been a huge advocate of this issue for, well over a decade, to see the momentum really pick up in recent years has just been very, very heartening. Maybe you could give our listeners just a little overview of what education freedom is and why it's so important.
Well, it's a great question, and it's something that is really fundamental to basically the basics of parental rights, right? That families, that parents, that children should be in the driver's seat for their education and what's best for them, instead of failed bureaucracy that has too often failed sometimes the most vulnerable of children and families across the United States in a one-size-fits-all system. And so when we talk about education freedom, it can take different elements, but essentially it is that basic really American principle that we empower parents to make the best decisions for their own kids, whether that's public, private, homeschool, charter school, some of these micro schools, and just the way that education has become really rethought coming out of the pandemic, especially. The movement that we've made across the United States, the Education Freedom Alliance, and great ALEC legislators, the men and women that are out there leading on these legislative efforts in the states, has been nothing short of miraculous. Pre-pandemic, we basically had Florida that started long ago under Jeb Bush and other great education reformers, and we had Arizona. And those were kind of the two states that we would highlight as being the top education freedom states, and really about the only states that were even approaching somewhat universal when it comes to education freedom. And yet here we come through the pandemic, and parents, as we all know, and those of us that are parents of small kids during that period of time, we started looking over our kids' shoulders more as they were learning at home because of the government lockdowns and shutdowns and what happened with public education. And parents started taking more interest and more effort into their own kids' education and really asking some important questions of, what are they being taught and why are they being taught that way? And so if there was any kind of a positive that could come out of that horrific period of lockdowns and everything that we saw, it was that parents did pay more attention to what their kids were being taught in public education and starting to ask those great questions to say, are we happy with that? Do we like the way they're being taught? Do we like the values? In many cases, the answer was no, and they started to look for alternatives. And of course, now we've seen the education freedom revolution as states adopt policies that enhance parental empowerment.
Right. I don't love this word, but I think of education freedom as like the singular equity issue of our time, because people, upper middle class and wealthy, have always had the opportunity to have education freedom. I mean, we can move to the neighborhood that has good district schools, or we can pull our kids out and pay for private schools. How does the education freedom movement that's happening, all the great legislation that ALEC is championing with the help of JCN and others, help less fortunate, underserved communities, people without means, have that same education school choice opportunity?
Well, it's a great question, and it's something that we in our education freedom index that we put out every year at alec.org, detail by state, to look at the resume of the various policies that states can enact to empower everyone across the board, regardless of income levels. Because you're exactly right. At the basic piece of it is that someone's zip code should not determine their educational opportunity. And that's a key principle, right? And so, whether that is things like education tax credits that some states have passed very effectively at the state level. I know we want to talk about what happened with the one big beautiful bill at the federal level with the Trump administration offering that federally. You have education savings accounts that many states have put together to say we're going to have an account that parents control that are able to use that money deposited every year to the education outcome of their choosing for their kids. Another way that states have enacted this is having better virtual education options, not the government forced virtual that we saw during the pandemic, but real private sector driven options, especially for folks in rural areas and remote communities that are very difficult to come into a far off in person schooling opportunity. And then the other thing that we look at is even within public education, there's so many ways that we should continue to improve public education in the United States, where there's no reason that we're giving up on public education just because we're talking about all these great choice opportunities for parents to homeschool and go to private schools and charter schools. The vast majority of American students are still educated in public education. So, what are we doing to improve the outcomes within the public systems and to make sure that we teach real American history through civics and things like that? And one of the ways that we do that is allow for open enrollment to allow parents, back to this issue of the zip code, that they're not stuck in a failing school district just because of the neighborhood they can afford to live in. And so that's another great ALEC model policy to enhance the public education system at the same time as we're bringing competition and real choice for parents. And so the outline of the options, I think, are great on our Education Freedom Index. Encourage everyone to check it out, see how your state ranks. And as it turns out, Jordan, coming full circle to the states that started this movement towards education freedom a decade or two ago, Florida and Arizona still rank at the top of the system. It's just a bunch of the other states have caught up in recent years. And that's a great development.
Right. So, how many states would you say now have education freedom? And maybe you could give us some of the most recent developments or some of the best practices that you're seeing.
Well, right. It's depending on how you count, right? And different groups count a little bit differently on this. I mean, we have approaching 20 states that are universal education freedom states. And, there are some that still need to improve, and some have appropriations caps, let's say, on the amount of money that can be used in a given year. And that goes through the normal budget process of the state. And we would love to see those numbers higher in many states. Louisiana is a great example that, in practice, the Gator plan was a great piece of reform, but in practice it hasn't been funded properly. And so as a result, they fell dramatically in our new Education Freedom Index for 2026. But when you look at the totality of what's gone on across the United States, I mean, you have a couple of big plans that have just come online. Texas, for instance, which was the really big victory that took a long time to get, a decade in the works, now has hundreds of thousands of kids, voluntarily signing up to be a part of that program with the parents, and so that's an extremely exciting development. You have, for the case of one of the first out of the pandemic, we talked about Arizona and Florida being first out of the gate. But then West Virginia, under our ALEC board member, Senator Patricia Rucker, who fearlessly led that effort for the Hope Scholarship program in West Virginia, this school year, that becomes fully universal. And there was, interestingly enough, Jordan, as I think you all have followed, there was a big effort to pare that back from some in the legislature. Thankfully, Governor Morrissey, Senator Rucker, and their allies prevailed, and cooler heads prevailed, and that Hope Scholarship reform will go forward. But there's so many great examples like that that we document every year in our report. But I think the important point is the momentum is growing, is continuing every single year as we add more states that are adding more appropriations to the choice programs and also enacting new laws that will bring more choice, whether it's private choice through ESAs and through tax credit scholarships, or whether it's more choice in the public system through things like open enrollment.
Right, right. And I imagine these programs work in conjunction with each other. So, for instance, we're working a lot in Georgia right now, which last year enacted the Promise scholarships, $6,500 for folks in the bottom 25% of public school districts. Now, one of the contentions from the left has been, oh, $6,500, that isn't going to be enough to pay for private school tuition. But then on top of that, I mean, to hold that argument for a second, I'm sure you have a contention to it. But then on top of that, there's also the tax credits, the state tax credits, which allow thousands more dollars to be directed to student scholarship organizations. So, can those two things pair with each other to generate the funds necessary for a family to escape the failing public school and go to a school, an effective private school?
Well, right, and and a lot of private education options and schools that are affiliated with religious institutions and churches and synagogues are happy to help accommodate families as
Right.
well, and to reduce tuition based on some of the need that's there in the community. So you combine some of these policies that have been passed successfully in places like Georgia with the ability and just the willingness of some of these providers to work with the families where they're at. And I think that argument's really a straw man argument to say that this isn't going to be a major help for those families. And you look at it, certain areas across the country, especially rural areas, and $6,500 goes a long ways to paying for a full K-12 scholarship in a given year for a family. And so I think that that's an argument that's thrown out there, but I don't think it holds a lot of water.
hmm hmm Yeah, so what JCN is working right now actually is this week is the final week of the legislature session in Georgia, and they have a state scholarship program that is maxes out at $120 million a year. And that cap is reached on the first day every year. There's such high demand for it. So the Senate has passed legislation to increase that, nearly double it to $235 million. We just need the House to agree, and we're hoping that comes through here before the end of the week to help even more Georgia families get the education they deserve. Let's turn for a minute now from the states to the federal level. You mentioned last year's part of the Big Beautiful Bill, a federal tax credit. Could you give us the broad strokes of that and how that one works?
Well, this is a really innovative program that is the first federal school choice program that came out of the One Big Beautiful Bill signed into law by President Trump on that famous day on July 4th back last year. And then, we did a lot of, rightly so, conversation around the great pro-growth tax elements of that. But a lot of times, what got lost in the shuffle was the discussion of this just revolutionary education freedom policy that was attached to the same piece of legislation. And you have the federal tax credit scholarship, the education freedom scholarship accounts that the president authorized through that. And you also have the expansion of the popular 529 savings plans as well. And that was something that really did fly under the radar, allowing for a doubling of K-12 expenses to be used under federal law from $10,000 to $20,000 annually. So that was a huge victory. But going back to the scholarship, it allows for scholarship granting organizations to receive the $1,700 per year that individuals can donate and receive a dollar for dollar federal tax credit back in return. Now, the hiccup was a part of the compromise in the Senate here in Washington, D.C., that originally it was designed that all states would participate. The compromise was that states have to opt in. And so right now we're going through that process. We have been very involved working with our ALEC legislators and with governors that are aligned in the states. Now we have 28 states that have voluntarily opted into that program. And a couple I wanted to point out that are especially, I think, important to note. One is Democrat Governor Jared Polis of Colorado opted in early on in the process, and the first governor on the Democrat side of the aisle, proving that this is bipartisan victory for President Trump and members of Congress, and more importantly for families. But secondly, even when you have some governors that have been vetoing this piece of legislation that have been pursued by a legislative branch as well, and that's an option that legislators can pass a law opting in as well. Just recently, you had Governor Beshear in Kentucky veto that law and deny the people of Kentucky the opportunity to receive those scholarships granted by the federal government. Thankfully, the Kentucky legislature led by ALEC board member Representative Kim Mosier, just overrode the governor's veto. And so Kentucky now is the 28th state that has now opted in, and that was a legislatively driven piece of it. So incredible opportunity for now states to take the lead. More than half of the states are there. We expect several more to move in that direction. I think looking at Kansas right now, it's very likely that they will be next to take an override attempt at Governor Laura Kelly's veto on that measure as well. So exciting things happening in the states, but that was all set into motion by the One Big Beautiful Bill. Got a lot of attention on the tax policy side, but a huge education reform victory in that piece of legislation federally.
Wow, no kidding. That is really exciting. Where I'd like to see a little bit more motion, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is publicizing taking the credit for the average taxpayer. I'm based here in Michigan. My state hasn't opted in, but for a dollar for dollar credit, I still, of course, plan to max that out on my tax return just to help any family in the state, whether it's Michigan. I mean, obviously, I'd love to help the kids in my community, but if I can't, any American kid, what are your thoughts on trying to publicize this tax credit more so more dollars get into it and making the program even more effective?
Well, it's a great question. As a Michigan native myself, I commiserate with, unfortunately, Governor Whitmer not taking advantage of this incredible opportunity for families, and the money is just sitting there on the table to be used by others at this point, but not allowed to be used by Michigan families, and that's a travesty. As a resident of Virginia, what I plan to do when the program officially opens up on January 2027 is to find a worthy entity, a scholarship granting organization in another state that has opted in. Right? And there's some debate even in Virginia right now with the transition between the Youngkin administration and Governor Spanberger's administration is what will happen in Virginia's case. But either way, I will plan to every year max out on that to a worthy scholarship granting organization in the state that has opted in. And that's something that, to your point, I have talked to some of our legislators about this. Hey, if you're a great school in, let's say, the Panhandle of West Virginia, and those of us in Virginia can't donate to a scholarship grant organization in Virginia, let's advertise who are those best and most opportunistic, best opportunities for us to donate to a scholarship granting organization in another state. Because I think it would be a travesty, A, for states not taking advantage of this program, but B, those of us who support this movement towards education, freedom, and parental empowerment, we need to be using all the resources at our disposal to enhance this movement across the country. And President Trump gave us that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, an uncapped dollar for dollar tax credit, I think, is it up to $1,700? Is that correct? Or
$1,700 annually. And so that's just money sitting there that families, even in other states, will be able to use so effectively to provide those educational opportunities for families.
Yeah, as much as we all love how our tax dollars are spent, to be able to direct $1,700 of our tax dollars to something that's worthy of this is a gift that's just too good to pass up. So I really encourage all the small business listeners listening today to really talk to your accountants and consider making this donation. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first year. We didn't miss anything in 2025, did we, by not claiming it? It's 2026.
No, that's right. It's starting at January 2027. For that. So it's a little bit of a phase-in period here, but now is the opportunity, A, for states to get it right and to opt in and list those scholarship granting organizations. And then those of us that would like to partake in that program, that kicks off a little bit later.
Perfect. Well, Jonathan, where can I direct our listeners and viewers to learn more about this initiative and learn more about Alec's great work and maybe some of your research and writing, which I'm sure is really incisive on this?
Well, thank you. ALEC.org is a great resource where you can view the Education Freedom Index that we've talked about, see how your state ranks and what you can do to continue this progress towards education freedom right in your very home state. But also visit our Education Freedom Alliance as well and just keep up to date with all the great work that we and you and all of our great allies are doing across the states on that.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Jonathan, thanks a lot for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's Small Business Megaphone. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can find audio version anywhere you get your podcast. And you can watch the show on Job Creators Network's YouTube and Rumble channels. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode.